Hello, History 363. So today we're going to be talking about Roman citizen voting assemblies. And since we're on the topic of voting and we have a momentous election coming up, actually let me just start off by reminding you all, if you're not registered to vote, please do so. The New York State voter registration deadline is October 9th, and you can register online. Of course, if you have a home state that's not New York, I would encourage you to register and vote in that state, but you will have to look up the deadline and the procedures for registering, which usually can be done pretty easily on the internet. Look for your Secretary of State site. So the Roman Republic has an important component of popular participation. And indeed, one thing that historians argue about is to what extent can we consider the Roman Republic a form of democracy? The idea that the Roman Republic was democratic is actually associated with a scholar named Fergus Miller, who has recently died. And the pendulum swings back and forth. I would actually say that many scholars are maybe swinging away from how responsive the Roman Republic is to popular pressures and democratic action. I'm actually, even in these trying times, I'm actually somewhat bullish on Roman democracy. But today we'll be considering the role that the Roman people play in expressing their will through voting in the voting assemblies. Now, I guess a couple key things about how Romans vote. First off, to the extent that the Romans, to the extent that Rome is a democracy, it's a direct democracy. So it is not like our democracy, where in New York, we vote for representatives, say the people who go into the New York State Legislature and go down the road at Albany, and they make the laws. When the Roman people pass a law, they vote for it directly. The voters directly approve or vote down the law in a way that happens in a few states, including California, where I'm from, where voters can directly approve laws through a ballot proposition process. In Rome, that's the only way laws get made. The individual voters actually have to come and approve the law in the voting assembly. Importantly, all voting takes place in Rome. So there is only one place to vote. It is in the city of Rome, which means if you live outside the city of Rome, and indeed, by the 3rd century BC, there are people who live hundreds of miles away from the city of Rome, as the Agro Romanus has extended across large swaths of central Italy. But there are no remote precincts. There is no voting by mail. The only way that you can vote is in person in the actual physical space where the assembly is held. And as we'll see, there's actually a multitude of physical spaces where Roman voting can take place, but all of them are in Rome. And of course, if you are bearish on Roman democracy, that's one real reason to be bearish. In order to vote, many Roman citizens will have to walk dozens to hundreds of miles in order to get to a position where they can vote. And if you are a poor marginal peasant who's working the land and maybe barely getting by, how much time do you actually have to go down and vote for whatever law the tribune of the plebs is proposing, or how interested are you in voting in the election for aedile? Now, there are three big assemblies, and one important thing is the Romans don't have just a single assembly. They actually have multiple assemblies that the configuration of the assembly changes, even if it's the exact same people voting in all of these assemblies. So the first big assembly is the Comitia Centuriata, the Centuriate Assembly, in which the citizens all vote in units called centuries. And that's another important thing about the way the Romans vote. The Romans never count individual votes and then say, well, what does the majority want? Romans first vote in their unit. The majority of that voting unit then becomes one vote. And then they count how many voting units it takes to reach a majority of voting units. Basically, as we ponder the kind of hellish landscape created by the Electoral College, that's basically how all Roman voting works. In that you don't, at the end of the day, you're not, it doesn't matter who wins the majority vote, it matters who wins the majority of the electors. Same with Roman voting. It doesn't matter how many people vote, it's how the voting units align with one another. So the voting unit in the Centuriate Assembly, the Comitia Centuriata, is the century. And every Roman is assigned a century based on their wealth and their age. So this is a timocratic assembly, in that not everyone's vote is weighted the same. So each century's vote is equal, but the way that the centuries are allotted to people on the basis of wealth gives many more voting centuries to the very wealthy. So there are total 193 centuries. Of those 193 centuries, 18 go to the equites, the wealthiest of Romans who have a sufficient census rating. And this is what the censors do, is they actually take an assessment of everybody's property, and that determines how you vote. So the equites are so wealthy that they are allotted 18 centuries. These centuries are actually true centuries. So to be assigned to the 18 centuries of the equites, only 1,800 men are actually assigned to these centuries. They're the men who are eligible for what's called a public horse, which is given to men who are wealthy enough to serve in the cavalry, who meet this, we're not quite sure what it is, but meet a certain very high census category. So the very wealthiest people, 1,800 of those now control 18 full centuries out of 193. So darn near 10% of the vote for probably a little more than 1% of the population, adult male population. The next class is the first class. These men serve in the infantry, although many of them are wealthy enough that they can serve in the cavalry if they bring their own horse. And so the members of the first class, by Polybius's day, by the middle of the 2nd century BC, are worth 10,000 denarii. A denarius is a silver coin. And to put that in perspective, a legionary serving makes a denarius every about 3 days. And so 10,000 denarii, which is the wealth of your property, that's the minimum to be in the first class. That's a pretty sizable holding. And the members of the first class, so men worth over 10,000 denarii, get 70 centuries. And actually, indeed, prior to probably the 240s BC, they got 80 of the centuries. And then they actually reduce it down so that they're reduced down. So there's 70 centuries plus 18 centuries. So that means the two, sort of the equites in the first class control close to half of all of the centuries. And again, right there, that's maybe the top 15% of the population. But they've got almost half of the voting power. The rest of the centuries are distributed between classes 2 and 5. We're not entirely sure the exact allotment, although you'll see people who make educated guesses. And then 1 century is reserved for the very poorest of Romans, the proletarii, people who are too poor to serve in the Roman army, although they can be forced to serve in the Roman navy. So these are people who are either rural paupers, people who own almost no land, people who are sort of the poor who live in the city. Now, it's debated exactly how many proletarii there are, but one thing is we can't tell from Roman naval deployments in the 3rd century BC. The Romans are routinely able to deploy 20 20, 30,000 rowers. And that gives us some size of how many proletariat might have been lumped into a single century. So there are tens of thousands of people in this one century compared to a century of the Equites where there's 100 people. So this is a democratic voting assembly where the votes are weighted towards the rich. It's also a gerontocratic voting assembly where the votes are weighted towards the elderly. In that, at least in the first class, and probably in classes down the line, the voting centuries are divided into centuries of juniors, uniores, and seniors, seniores. The cutoff is 45, and 45 being seen as the age in which a man is too old for military service. Those centuries they each get one vote, except when we think about how the lifespan works in the ancient world. It's a brutal demographic regime, and we'll talk about Roman demographics, I hope, later on in this course. But suffice to say, people start dying off before the age of 45. So if you take everyone from all the men from a certain class and say we're going to split you, there's going to be way fewer seniores than uniores, and yet each century gets one vote, which means fewer seniores have as much influence on policy as more uniores all lumped into a century. This voting assembly, the Comitia Centuriata, is, you might say, the least democratic of the active Roman voting assemblies. It gives much more weight to the votes of the wealthy, and tends to give more weight to the votes of the elderly. Its big goal is to elect consuls. So the most high-profile election, the one election that some aristocrats are planning all their lives to run for, is the consulship. That's the Comitia Centuriata, as is the praetorship. No surprise, since both of those positions come with imperium. Also, the Comitia Centuriata elects the censors. Even though censors don't have imperium, it's, again, because of the prestige of the office. Once every 5 years when censors are elected, the Comitia Centuriata is the, if it's electing a consul, it makes sense that it should also elect the censor. Now, the Comitia Centuriata had at one point been an army assembly. The century, as we'll see later this week, is a basic building block of the Roman army. Suffice it to say, at a pretty early point, the Comitia Centuriata does not look like the Roman army looks, or like a Roman legion looks. The sort of the political organization of the Comitia Centuriata may sort of preserve some archaic forms of the Roman army, but the Roman army evolves pretty rapidly, so that if it had been an army assembly in the 5th century, it most certainly isn't by the 4th. By the 3rd, at least. It doesn't reflect the makeup of the Roman army, which is mostly probably men from lower in the class system. The men in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th class are probably the majority of the legion, and they actually don't have that much clout in the Comitia Centuriata, which really gives a lot of weight to the equites and the first class. So that is one of our Roman voting assemblies. Now, because it's a former army assembly, it meets outside the sacred demilitarized boundary of the city of Rome, the Pomerium, out on the Campus Martius, which at one point may have been also the mustering field for the Roman army. So it meets sort of outside the sacred boundary of the city, and eventually it meets in a space that's called the Ovile, and that probably is a sheep pen. And that's probably because essentially they take a field and then they set up sort of ropes and barriers and kind of like you might see for crowd control in an airport to actually herd the voters, to make sure everyone's voting in their right century, and to make sure that all of the the different groups go to where they're supposed to go. So that is the Comitia Centuriata. Now that being said, the Romans also, every Roman has a tribe. There are 35 tribes, at least by 241, there are 35 tribes. And each tribe is geographically based. It covers a distinct part of the Roman territory. Although, as they keep adding Roman citizens after 241, they don't increase the number of tribes, but they start simply sort of saying, oh, hey, a new patch of Roman citizens has been, say we've promoted some cives sine suffragio. We're going to just tack them onto X or Y tribe. And so a lot of the tribes have a kind of ancillary little sort of pools or islands out deep in the Ager Romanus. But nonetheless, wherever you're born, you know exactly what tribe that belongs to, and tribal affiliation sticks with you for life. Different from the affiliation in centuries, where your affiliation can change as you get richer, get poorer, get older. The century you vote in changes. The tribal does not. You will always have the same tribe. Indeed, the Romans, their tribal identity is so important to them that it is part of the formal Roman name. You write the full name. Obviously, there's the trinomina, but oftentimes you'll actually include your tribal affiliation. So your tribe sticks with you for life, even if you move around. So there are 35 tribes. The tribes are roughly equal. They're not perfectly balanced. It doesn't seem there's ever an attempt to perfectly balance them, but probably they are roughly equal. So unlike the centuries, which are grossly and deliberately unequal, the tribal assembly is more democratic in that it comes closer to some kind of principle of one person, one vote, in that when you vote by tribes, the tribes technically have the same number of people behind them, although they don't necessarily have the same number of people voting in any given election. Remember, the people from the urban tribes, there are 4 urban tribes, live in Rome. It's not hard if they hear that a committee, an assembly is being called, to say, hey, I got nothing to do, and it's fun to vote, and politics is a hobby of mine. Let's just go vote. Well, those people who can easily vote are then moved. They vote in 4 tribes. The people who have to come for hundreds of miles are from the 31, well, in some instances, hundreds of miles. In some instances, they may be coming for 10 miles, but there are 31 rural tribes. So 4 urban tribes, 31 rural tribes. In many instances, there may be fewer people coming from those rural tribes, right? Because they do have a great distance, whether it's 10 miles or 20 miles or 50 miles. That's a long time to vote on whatever's being voted on. So even though the tribes themselves on the census rolls are probably roughly the same. Let's say, if we assume a Roman citizen body of 300,000 people, 8 or 9,000, give or take. But in an actual voting assembly, you might see a ton of people voting in the 4 urban tribes, and only a smattering of people voting in the rural tribes. In fact, we do know that there is a quorum. There have to be at least 5 people voting in a tribe for its vote to count. And so, again, it's not a perfect. It's definitely not a one person, one vote system in that regard. Even if the number of voters that are allotted to each tribe on the lists are more roughly equal. And of course, the people who can afford to come in from a distance and vote in those rural tribes are probably wealthier farmers who have enough land and enough produce, enough prosperity that they feel that they can take the day off or 2 days off to go into Rome and vote. Now, the tribal assembly can vote in a number of different places. It votes in the city, within the Pomerium. It can vote there is a place called the Comitium in Rome itself, right in front of the Senate House, that unfortunately, because there's so much imperial stuff on top of it, we don't have a great sense of what the sort of Republican Comitium might have looked like. There's a couple of archaeological hypotheses. We can't say it's not that big. At most, it can accommodate maybe a couple of thousand voters. Now, we do know this, that at a certain point, the whole forum could be used to accommodate the increased number of voters in the tribal assembly. And the forum could maybe accommodate, depending on what parts of the forum you use, maybe 10,000 voters. Remember, prior to the Second Punic War, we're looking at about 325,000 adult male citizens. So, and you can fit 2,000 in the committee, and you can fit maybe 10,000 in the forum. Sometimes the tribal assembly will also meet up on the Capitoline Hill in front of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Our best guess is that also can accommodate maybe 10, maybe 12,000 people. And of course, maybe more also if tribes waited to vote. If only one tribe goes up at a time and the rest wait at the bottom, you could accommodate more. And incidentally, the Ovile, where the Comitia Centuriata meets, at most, best guess, 20 to 30,000. So at best, 10% of the Roman citizen body can vote in the Comitia Centuriata, and maybe a third of that on the Capitoline or in the forum. So again, the voter participation rates are going to be quite low. Although we should note that for an Athenian election, 10% is really, really good. At any rate, the Comitia Tributa, the tribal assembly, has sort of two divisions. And probably actually depends who's calling it. If it's called by a tribune of the plebs, it probably is a concilium plebis, although oftentimes it's referred to as the tribal assembly, even when a tribune of the plebs is calling it and presiding over it. Probably technically patricians aren't supposed to vote, and it almost is irrelevant whether they do or not, because there's not many, there's almost, compared to the plebeians, there's very, very few patricians. A tribal assembly can also be called by for example, a consul to elect aediles and tribunes and quaestors and military tribunes. Those elections would be supervised at least by the consul. So a consul can also call this assembly. Probably that would be considered the tribal assembly and not a concilium plebis, because it's not a tribune of the plebs, or an aedile can also summon the concilium plebis. So in some ways, it's the exact same assembly. It's voting in tribes. It's almost all plebeian, 99% plebeians one way or the other. But depending on who's calling the assembly, a tribune of the plebs or a consul, the nature of the assembly changes. And again, the tribal assembly has important elective functions. It elects almost all of the other magistrates. So if you want to be aedile, that's the people that you're going to face, the people in the tribal assembly. Again, when they're electing the plebeian aediles, it's technically a concilium plebis, but the distinction is negligible by the time we get to the Middle Republic. And indeed, the later Romans themselves are kind of confused. When is it a concilium plebis and when is it the tribal assembly? Now, both of these, or all three of these assemblies, if we count the tribal assembly and concilium plebis as separate, and along with the Comitia Centuriata, so those three big assemblies, all of them can pass laws. So if a consul wants to pass a law, and consuls occasionally do, they would usually go to the Comitia Centuriata. If a tribune of the plebs wants to pass a law, he will go to the concilium plebis, and it's called by a tribune of the plebs. Let's call it the concilium plebis. Technically, that law would be called a plebiscite, whereas a law passed by the Comitia Centuriata is called a lex, although sometimes those terms get eventually used interchangeably, particularly after the Lex Hortensia, which says that plebiscites are binding upon the whole Roman people. They're basically identical to what a lex would be. So those are the big assemblies. And again, you could have the exact same group of people, call them together and say, we're going to elect an aedile, and we're the tribal assembly, and then say, everyone quick, go to the Avile, we're going to elect a consul. and they would elect that. They would switch from tribes to centuries and elect the consul, and it'd be the same people, but 2 different assemblies, 2 different configurations, 2 different locations. So those are our voting assemblies. One final note on voting, and then I'll let you go. During the Middle Republic, down to the 130s BC, voting is what we would call viva voce voting, live voice voting. So there is no secret ballot. You know, when a century comes up to vote, they'll pick someone by lot. Either they'll ask the century how to vote, or at some point they'll actually pick someone by lot. He'll cast his vote, and then the rest of the century can follow behind him. But everyone is voting. Everyone knows what your vote is. There is no secret ballot. So that means that this is a potential moment that the aristocrats who are running the election, and an election has to be overseen by a consul, they can actually, in some ways, influence the vote. That is, you say that the elections between Caesar and Bibulus, which incidentally, when Caesar and Bibulus run for consul in 59, there is a secret ballot. We'll talk about that. But Caesar or Bibulus, and you say, I want to vote Green Party, the consul can give you a death stare until you say, I mean Bibulus. So clearly, that the fact that it's known who the preference of the voters, this is a place where there is actually a potential for sort of aristocratic influence on the election. And in one instance, actually in several instances, we do know where a century votes one way and the consul says, that guy's an idiot, vote for somebody else. And because it's viva voce voting, he has the ability to make that intervention. All right, I think that's enough on Roman voting. We will talk next about the Roman Senate and then the Roman army as we continue our exploration of Roman institutions. I'll see you soon.